Computing 2, An Introduction to Programming. As I said in the last lecture, we very rarely write programs directly in instructions understood by a computer. Instead, we use what's known as a high-level language, and there are many of these, and I showed you this list before. This is just a small selection with 3 of the most popular for bioinformatics shown in orange: C, Perl and Python, also JavaScript, which is used within web interfaces, and also things like C++, Java and Fortran are still quite popular, but not as popular as the others. We can divide programming languages up into 3 different classifications. So the first of these is paradigm. So some languages are procedural. This basically means you start at the beginning and you work through to the end, sometimes calling subroutines or functions that do work for you. The other major paradigm is object-oriented, where you think in terms of objects rather than functions. So a function is associated with an object rather than being something that you do with a piece of data. So an example might be something like in a supermarket. You might think of a can of beans as being an object, and it would have various properties associated with it, such as its size, its price, and so on. And you might have a function that takes a number of cans of a given size and works out the price for that number, perhaps applying a discount if you've bought 5 cans. Functional languages are a rather unusual type of language where you don't exactly explain to the programming language what you wish to do. Instead, you say something that you want to get out. So the database search languages are like this. We'll see more of this with SQL, that you don't say what you want the computer to do. You just say, this is the data that I need to get. So we can divide in that dimension. We can also divide in this dimension of compiled versus part compiled and interpreted. We will go into the differences between compiled and interpreted languages in more detail later, but just to say this category in the middle of part compiled languages actually includes things like Python, where the first time you run a Python program, it will run it through its Python interpreter, but it will save a part compiled version so that the next time you run it, it will run faster. And JIT means just-in-time compiler. That means that it will compile the program as it reads it in and run it somewhat faster as a result. And that also applies to Python and also to languages like Perl. And then along the bottom we have 3 types of language: general purpose languages, things like Python, Perl, C, Fortran, all these sorts of things. Markup languages, which are not really programming languages but allow you to mark up data, so things like HTML used on the web, XML and so on. And specialized languages, which are used for particular functions. So SQL as a database query language is an example of one of those. So I said I would come back to the difference between compiled and interpreted languages. Remember that at the center of your computer you have a processor. Typically this will be an Intel processor or an AMD processor, and this is what actually does the computing work. In an interpreted language we have a source file, a file which describes our program. It's the steps that our program needs to take. And what happens is that has to run through a program called an interpreter, which talks to the processor. It interprets each line of the language that you have written, talks to the processor, reads in some data, outputs some data, based on the instructions. So your program itself is not talking directly to the processor at all, it's going via this interpreter. In a compiled language, your source file is run through a program called a compiler, and that then produces an executable program. That executable is now able to talk directly to the processor and can read and write data. So these have different advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage of the interpreted languages are that they're faster to develop software, because you don't have to worry about this step of compiling a program. You can easily modify your source file and just test whether it works properly. On the other hand, the compiled programs, you have to go through this compilation step to produce an executable before you can actually test the code. But the advantage is that when you have an executable program, you don't have to go through this translation process of translating your source code into something that the processor can understand, which is what an interpreter does and a compiler does. But once you've got that executable in place, it can talk directly to the processor and do whatever it needs to do. Now, the major reasons that that is an advantage are, first of all, that the code runs faster, and secondly, that if you wish to distribute your code without distributing the source code, you can do that, and it makes it much more difficult for people to copy or understand what's going on inside your code, which may or may not be a good thing. But obviously, if you're a commercial company like Microsoft, you don't want people being able to see exactly how your code works. Now, I already gave you some examples of these different types of language, but just a few more here. Interpreted languages include things like Perl, TCL, and Bash. That's the scripting language that you can use from the command line on a Unix type operating system. Compiled languages include things like C, C++, Fortran, part compiled things like Java and Python, and just-in-time compilers, well, Perl and Python are just-in-time compilers of different sorts. Python, as I said, will write a partly compiled file for you. Perl, on the other hand, compiles each time it reads in the source code. And Smalltalk is another language which uses a just-in-time compiler. Let's talk a little bit about the most popular languages. So first of all, C is a general purpose language. It's compiled, it's procedural, it's one of the most widely used programming languages of all time. It is fairly low level. In other words, the programming that you do in C is relatively close to the hardware. You don't have some of the same abstractions and things that you have in other languages. Consequently, it is very fast, but it's also relatively difficult to program. So, for example, there is no thing in C that is really a string, so for storing characters. Instead, we just have an array, or list in Python language, of letters, which have to be ended with a special character, a null character, to say this is the end of the string. So that means that it's faster because it's closer to the hardware, but it's more difficult to do things like join strings together and that sort of thing. Perl is another general purpose language. This time it's interpreted with a just-in-time compiler, and it's again procedural. So Perl stands for Practical Extraction and Reporting Language. It borrows from a lot of other languages such as C, so it's quite easy if you're a C programmer to start programming in Perl. It also borrows a lot of ideas from Bash, the command line scripting language, awk, which is also a built-in language in Unix machines, and sed, which stands for stream editor. So it's very good for things like text processing, parsing files, extracting data from files, and replacing things in files. It has been very popular for CGI scripting, in other words, writing software that sits behind websites, for graphics programming, system administration, network programming, finance, bioinformatics, and various other applications. It has been nicknamed the Swiss Army chainsaw of scripting languages, and also as the duct tape that holds the internet together. And for bioinformatics type purposes, there is a BioPerl library which covers a lot of standard things that you want to be able to do in bioinformatics. And Python, again, is a general purpose, just-in-time, part-compiled language, and it's object-oriented. So normally the design emphasizes code readability. It has a concise syntax. To me, however, those two things don't really go together. Concise syntax means you have to understand that syntax, and that to me makes the code more difficult to read. The big advantage of Python is really not the language itself, it's the number of libraries of routines that come with it. So it has an extremely comprehensive standard library, which means that a lot of things that you need to do are already in the language, and that makes it very much easier. Plus there are very comprehensive maths libraries and scientific libraries, and there's a BioPython library, a bit like BioPerl, for bioinformatics type problems in Python. There are also lots of things for visualization and that sort of thing, which really makes it very, very useful. So now we're going to come on to a specialized language for accessing databases. Now I've mentioned this language before. It's called SQL or SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. Now we looked at this example before of creating a table of, in this case, proteins, protein accession codes, identifiers, species names, and names. And pointed out the problem that can occur with a table like this, that you could make a mistake in the spelling of the species name, and that the process that we go through in order to avoid this is known as normalization, and this is from one of COD's rules, to split the table into subtables. So whenever you see a repeating item in a column, you know that that should come out into another table. So we'd split this into those two tables, one which is the protein accession, identifier, species identifier as a number, and the protein name. And then we have a separate table which has this numeric species identifier and the correctly spelled name of the species. At this point we're going to take a short break, and during that time I have two little exercises for you to do, and the first of these is based on this table. So this is a slightly simpler table than we saw before, just has an accession code, a protein name, and a species name. So what I want you to do is work out how you would split this into two tables in a logical fashion so that we avoid repeating data in a column. Hopefully that should be very simple for you, because it's exactly the same process as we went through in that last example. The second exercise is a little bit more complicated. This one needs to be split into 4 different tables. So I'm not going to tell you what those tables ought to be, but I'm going to give you a couple of clues. First of all, we want to look for repeating things in columns. And we also want to think about entities. In other words, what you might consider in an object-oriented language as an object, something that you can kind of pin down as an individual item. So in this case, if you're thinking about what's going on here, we've got proteins. What else have we got? So obviously proteins, but what other entities are there? And put each of those entities into a separate table. Okay, so as I said, we're going to take a break at that point, and when we continue, we'll go through an explanation of those two exercises.